And so we're going to kind of use that as a springboard today to
Right.
dive into the shadow self.
I love it.
Yeah. So, one of the things that I found really interesting about their conversation is that they start off
Okay.
by talking about this anecdote that Jordan Peterson shares about a
Right.
friend of his
Yeah.
who was a social worker in this really rough and tumble oil boom town.
Oh, wow.
Yeah. And this guy was like,
I'm intrigued already.
I know, right?
An oil boomtown social worker.
He was dealing with like delinquents and like really tough situations.
Wow.
Yeah. And in one of the stories that Peterson tells, he actually talks about how his friend
Yeah.
had to use a table leg as a weapon.
Oh my goodness, a table leg is a weapon.
I know, right?
That's wild.
It's intense. So I think that's like a good place to start
I love it.
because it's like so vivid and
Yeah.
and it really kind of draws you in.
Absolutely. But I'm curious about, I guess, the point of the story, right?
Yeah.
It's not to glorify violence, is it?
No, not at all. I think Peterson is using this story
Yep.
to illustrate what he calls an integrated shadow.
An integrated shadow.
Yeah. So basically what he's saying is that his friend was this really tough guy, obviously, right?
Right.
He could handle these really difficult situations, but at the same time,
Yeah.
Peterson emphasizes that he was also like a fundamentally good person.
Okay, so there's this like balance
Yeah, there's this balance.
between the toughness and
Yeah.
the goodness.
Yeah, and so the idea is that he was able to navigate these like volatile situations so effectively.
Uh-huh.
Precisely because he understood that same potential for aggression within himself.
I see.
Does that make sense?
Yeah, it does. It's
Yeah.
like he had come to terms with his own capacity for those like darker impulses.
Yes.
And that allowed him to, I guess, meet those delinquents where they were,
Yeah, I think that's a really good way to put it.
to connect with them.
Yeah, and so it seems like what both Green and Peterson are getting at is that it's not about denying those darker impulses,
Uh-huh.
but somehow integrating them into our personality in a healthy way.
Right. It's like we all have this shadow self.
Yes.
This reservoir of like repressed impulses that we've kind of pushed down.
Yeah, and often stemming from childhood.
Oh, interesting.
Yeah, like those times when we felt intense anger or jealousy or
Yeah.
maybe even a desire to lash out.
Right. We're told to be good and well behaved, so we suppress those emotions.
Exactly. And so Green actually calls it a lost self.
A lost self.
Yeah, and he says that it can cause serious problems if we don't acknowledge it.
So it's not just about aggression, then it's about any emotion or impulse
Yeah.
that we kind of deem unacceptable or inappropriate.
Exactly. And that's where things start to get really interesting because
Oh.
both Green and Peterson argue that failing to acknowledge these shadow impulses can lead to a whole host of problems.
Problems like what?
Well, I mean, this whole lost self idea is making me a little nervous, to be honest.
Sure, I understand. Yeah.
Like, what happens if we just ignore it?
Well, for one thing, those repressed emotions don't just disappear.
Okay.
They can actually manifest in unhealthy ways.
Like how?
Think about it like passive aggression,
Okay.
resentment, or even self-sabotaging behaviors.
Oh, wow.
It's like this pressure cooker building up steam.
Right.
If you don't release it in a healthy way, it's eventually going to explode.
So we've got this shadow self full of all these like unacceptable impulses.
Right.
And we're supposed to integrate it somehow.
Yeah.
But how do we do that without becoming like the very delinquents that Peterson's friend was
Yeah.
dealing with?
That's the million-dollar question, isn't it?
Yeah.
It's a process that takes a lifetime of self-reflection and what's called shadow work.
Shadow work.
Yeah, have you heard of that?
I've heard the term, but I'm not really sure what it entails.
Yeah, it sounds kind of intense, right?
Yeah.
Well, essentially, shadow work involves bringing those unconscious impulses into conscious awareness.
Okay.
It's about shining a light on those dark corners of our psyche
Uh-huh.
and acknowledging the full spectrum of our being, both the good and the bad.
So it's about like really facing those parts of ourselves that we might not want to admit are there.
Exactly. And that's why I think Peterson's friend, the tough but fair social worker, is such a compelling example.
Right.
He wasn't afraid to confront the darkness within himself.
Yeah.
And that allowed him to connect with those delinquents on a deeper level.
And to ultimately help them. Right.
Exactly. He had integrated his shadow, which allowed him to approach those challenging situations with both strength and compassion.
So how do we actually go about doing this shadow work?
Well, the self-awareness is always the first step.
Okay.
It's about paying attention to your thoughts, feelings, and behaviors,
Mm-hmm.
especially those that make you feel uncomfortable or ashamed.
Right.
It's about asking yourself, why am I reacting this way?
Okay.
What is this emotion trying to tell me about myself?
So it's a journey of self-discovery.
It is.
But it doesn't sound like it's always a pleasant one.
No, not always.
Like, what if digging into our shadow just makes us feel worse about ourselves?
I mean, that's understandable.
Yeah.
Confronting those shadow aspects can be challenging,
Right.
even painful at times.
Yeah.
But remember, these impulses are a part of you,
Okay.
and denying them only gives them more power.
Oh, I see.
By acknowledging them, you can start to understand their origins
Okay.
and develop healthier ways of expressing them.
So it's not about eradicating those shadow impulses, but more about understanding and transforming them.
Exactly. Green uses a powerful analogy.
Okay.
He says it's like having a wild beast inside you.
Okay, a wild beast.
You can't just lock it away and pretend it doesn't exist,
Right.
but you also can't let it run rampant
Yeah.
and destroy everything in its path.
So we have to find a way to tame it.
You need to find a way to tame it,
Okay.
to channel its energy into something constructive.
I like that analogy, taming the beast.
Yeah.
But how do we actually go about doing that?
Well, that's where things like therapy journaling and creative expression can be incredibly helpful.
Okay.
They provide safe and structured ways to explore those shadow impulses
Yeah.
and integrate them into your personality.
So it's about finding healthy outlets for those darker impulses.
Exactly.
Ways to express them without harming ourselves or others.
Yes.
But isn't that kind of contradictory to what we often hear about suppressing negative emotions?
Well, it's not about suppressing them.
Okay.
It's about transforming them.
Yeah.
And it's definitely a different approach than that everyone gets a trophy mentality
Right.
that we see so often these days.
Yeah, that's an interesting point.
Yeah.
You're saying that this attempt to shield people from negative emotions might actually be doing more harm than good.
It's a valid concern, right?
Yeah.
By denying the reality of competition and striving,
Yeah.
are we inadvertently suppressing those natural drives
Right.
and preventing people from reaching their full potential?
Yeah, by trying to create a world where everyone is perfectly equal
Yeah.
and no one ever feels bad,
Yeah,
we might be inadvertently feeding the shadow self.
exactly.
Wow, that's a really thought-provoking idea.
It is,
So how do we strike a balance then?
right?
How do we acknowledge and integrate our shadow without giving it free rein to
Yeah.
wreak havoc in our lives?
Well, that's where Green and Peterson's insights become incredibly valuable.
Okay.
They offer practical strategies for harnessing those shadow impulses
Yeah,
and channeling them into something productive.
this is already blowing my mind.
Really?
Yeah, I'm so curious to hear what those strategies are.
Well, let's dive into that.
Okay.
Peterson, for example, is a big proponent of allowing children to express aggression in controlled ways,
Okay.
like through debate or sports.
So instead of repressing those impulses,
Yes.
we need to teach kids how to channel them constructively.
Exactly.
Yeah.
It's about helping them develop a healthy sense of self
Right.
and learn to navigate conflict in a way that benefits both themselves
Yeah.
and those around them.
This is definitely a far cry from just giving everyone a trophy to avoid hurt feelings.
It is.
Right.
Yeah.
So it seems like Peterson and Green are suggesting that repressing healthy ambition and competitiveness can have unintended consequences.
Yes, definitely.
They even point to the tragic example of Peterson's friend who,
Right.
feeling unable to reconcile his ambition with his desire to be a good person,
Yeah,
tragically took his own life.
that's right. A very sad story.
It is a stark reminder of what can happen when we deny those natural human drives.
Absolutely.
But I have to ask, are we really saying it's okay to feel ambition, even aggression?
It's not about labeling those emotions as good or bad.
Okay.
It's about recognizing that they are a part of us
Okay.
and understanding that denying them doesn't make them go away.
Right.
It just drives them underground where they can fester and cause problems.
So we have to find a way to make peace with our shadow self,
Yes.
to integrate those darker impulses in a way that aligns with our values and aspirations.
Precisely. And that's where things like self-awareness, healthy outlets, and a willingness to confront those uncomfortable truths about ourselves become absolutely crucial.
This is all so fascinating,
It is.
but it feels very theoretical.
Sure.
Can you give us some concrete examples of how to channel these shadow impulses in a healthy way?
Absolutely. Let's start with Green's personal experience.
Okay.
He's very open about using writing as an outlet for his anger. Yeah, he's even said he can only write when he taps into that raw emotion.
So he's turning that shadow impulse into fuel for his creative process.
Exactly.
It's almost like alchemy, you know?
Yeah.
Transforming something potentially destructive into something beautiful and insightful.
I love that.
Yeah.
And Peterson offers a similar perspective when he talks about how anger can actually suppress fear,
Okay.
giving us the courage to act.
Interesting.
He uses this vivid image of a cat cornered with a broom.
Okay.
Even though the cat is terrified,
Mm.
its anger will override that fear and make it attack.
Wow, that's a powerful image.
It is.
So we're starting to see a theme emerge here.
Yeah, what's that?
It's not about denying our shadow self,
Uh-huh.
but about understanding it and learning to channel those darker impulses in a way that actually benefits us.
Exactly. And that's a key takeaway for you.
Yeah.
You have a shadow self.
Yeah.
Everyone does.
Yeah.
Integrating it means acknowledging those darker impulses,
Uh-huh.
understanding their power, and then finding constructive ways to express them.
This is all incredibly insightful.
It is fascinating.
Yeah, I feel like I'm gaining a whole new understanding of myself and human nature in general.
I agree.
Yeah.
And we've only just scratched the surface.
I know there's so much more to explore when it comes to the shadow self.
There is.
But for now, let's take a moment to reflect on what we've learned so far.
Okay, sounds good.
We've covered a lot of ground,
Yeah, we have.
from understanding what the shadow self is
Uh-huh.
to exploring the potential consequences of denying it.
Right.
And we've even started to touch on some strategies for integrating it in a healthy way.
We have.
But before we dive into those strategies,
Okay.
I think it's important to address a common misconception.
Oh, okay. I'm curious what's that. So this common misconception about the shadow self is that
Yeah.
integrating our shadow means like giving those darker impulses
Mm-hmm.
free rein to run wild.
Right. So it's not about like becoming some
Right.
Machiavellian mastermind exploiting others for personal gains.
Not at all.
Mm-hmm.
Both Green and Peterson are very clear
Mm-hmm.
that integrating your shadow doesn't mean
Yeah.
abandoning your morals or acting without conscience.
Okay. So then how do we find that balance?
Yeah, it's a delicate dance, but one that's essential for personal growth.
Yeah.
And it requires a deep understanding of ourselves,
Okay.
our motivations, and the potential consequences of our actions.
So it's not just about finding healthy outlets for those darker impulses,
Yes.
but also about developing like a strong moral compass.
Exactly.
Yeah.
It's about recognizing that the shadow self is a double-edged sword.
Okay.
It can be a source of great strength and creativity,
Yeah.
and it can also be incredibly destructive
Right.
if it's not wielded responsibly.
This reminds me of Peterson's concept of order and chaos.
Oh, yeah.
He talks about how both are necessary for a meaningful life
Right.
and how too much of either can be detrimental.
I think that's a great connection.
Yeah.
The shadow self is very much a part of that chaotic element within us. It represents those primal urges and desires
Yeah.
that can disrupt the order we try to create in our lives.
Right.
But if we can learn to harness that chaos, to integrate it into our personality in a healthy way,
Yeah.
it can actually fuel our growth
Okay.
and lead us to a more fulfilling life.
So it sounds like we need to become masters of our own
Yes,
internal ecosystem,
I love that.
finding a way to balance those opposing forces within ourselves.
Precisely. It's about recognizing that the shadow self isn't some separate entity.
Uh-huh.
It's an integral part of who we are.
Right.
And by integrating it, we become more whole,
Okay.
more complete human beings.
So we've established that integrating our shadow is important,
Yes.
but it's not about giving in to our every dark impulse.
Correct.
We need to find a way to channel those impulses in a way that aligns with our values and contributes to something positive. But
Yeah.
how do we actually do that?
Right. That's the question.
Yeah. Can you give us some practical strategy?
Absolutely. Let's start with self-awareness. As we've already discussed, this is the foundation of shadow work.
Yeah.
We need to be honest with ourselves about those darker impulses,
Mm-hmm.
those aspects of our personality that we might be ashamed of or afraid to acknowledge.
That sounds like a pretty daunting task.
It can be.
It's much easier to just ignore those uncomfortable truths about ourselves.
It might be easier in the short term,
Yeah.
but ultimately it's self-defeating
Okay, why is that?
because those shadow impulses don't just go away when we ignore them.
Right.
They fester in the unconscious,
Okay.
influencing our thoughts and behaviors in ways we might not even be aware of.
So we're back to the pressure cooker analogy.
Exactly.
If we don't release that pressure in a healthy way,
Yeah.
it's going to explode eventually.
And the explosion might manifest as an outburst of anger,
Oh, wow.
a self-sabotaging behavior, or even a physical ailment.
So the first step is to really shine a light on those shadow aspects,
Yes.
to become aware of them and how they might be operating in our lives.
He said,
Okay, so let's say we've done the hard work of acknowledging
Oh,
those
well.
shattered impulses.
Yeah.
What's next?
Good question.
How do we actually start to integrate them in a healthy way?
That's where things like journaling, creative expression, and therapy can be incredibly helpful.
Okay, how so?
They provide a safe and structured environment
Yeah.
to explore those darker emotions and impulses without judgment.
So it's about creating a space where we can confront those shadow aspects
Yes.
without feeling like we need to suppress them or pretend they don't exist.
Exactly. And through that process of exploration,
Yeah.
we can start to understand the root causes of those impulses
Okay.
and develop healthier ways of expressing them.
Can you give me an example?
Sure. So, for example, if you notice that you have a tendency to be passive-aggressive,
Okay.
you can start to ask yourself, why am I behaving this way?
Right.
What need is this behavior trying to fulfill?
And through that process of self-reflection, we can start to identify those unhealthy patterns.
Yeah.
And develop new, more constructive ways of interacting with the world.
Precisely. And as you become more aware of those shadow impulses,
Okay.
you can also start to notice the triggers that tend to activate them.
Oh, the triggers.
Yeah, maybe it's a particular person, a certain situation, or even a specific thought pattern that sets you off.
And once you've identified those triggers,
Yeah.
you can start to develop strategies for managing them.
Exactly. It's like learning to anticipate a storm and taking shelter before it hits.
Right.
You might not be able to control the weather, but you can control how you respond to it.
This makes me think about Peterson's emphasis on taking responsibility
Yeah.
for our own emotions and actions.
Absolutely.
He talks about how we often blame others for how we feel,
Right.
but ultimately it's up to us to choose how we respond
No,
to the challenges we face.
That's a great connection, and it's a crucial aspect of shadow work.
okay.
It's about recognizing that we have a choice in how we respond to those darker impulses.
So we're talking about a shift from reactivity to proactivity.
Exactly. Instead of letting those shadow impulses dictate our actions,
Yeah.
we're consciously choosing how we want to express them.
And this is where things like channeling aggression into constructive outlets,
Yes.
as Peterson suggests, can be incredibly helpful.
Absolutely.
Can you give us some examples of what that might look like in practice?
Sure. It could be something as simple as engaging in a vigorous workout.
Okay.
When you feel that anger rising or channeling your frustration into a creative project.
Right.
It could be standing up for yourself in a difficult conversation
Okay.
or setting firm boundaries with someone who is trying to take advantage of you.
So it's about finding those activities that allow us to express those shadow impulses
Yes.
in a way that doesn't harm ourselves or others, but actually benefits us in some way.
Precisely. And the more we engage in this process of shadow work,
Yeah.
the more skilled we become at recognizing those impulses and channeling them effectively.
Okay.
It's like developing a muscle.
Mm-hmm.
The more we use it, the stronger it gets.
This is all starting to make sense, but I have to admit, I'm still a little apprehensive about this whole shadow work thing.
Yeah, I understand.
It sounds like a lot of hard work.
Yeah, it can be.
And potentially even painful.
It can be challenging.
What would you say to someone who's feeling hesitant to delve into their shadow?
I would say that confronting your shadow is an act of courage.
Okay.
It's not easy, but it's one of the most rewarding journeys you can embark on.
It sounds like you're speaking from personal experience.
I am.
Yeah.
We all have a shadow, and we all have to grapple with it in our own way.
Yeah.
But I can tell you from my own experience that the rewards far outweigh the challenges.
What kind of rewards are we talking about?
For starters, greater self-awareness, a deeper understanding of yourself and others,
Okay.
and a greater capacity for compassion and empathy.
That sounds pretty amazing.
It is.
But what about the more tangible benefits?
Sure.
How can shadow work actually improve our lives in a practical sense?
Well, as we've already discussed, channeling those shadow impulses in a healthy way can lead to increased creativity, productivity, and even personal power.
I'm starting to see how this all ties back to Green's work on power.
Oh, yeah.
He talks about how understanding and mastering human nature,
Right.
including those darker aspects, is essential for achieving success in any field.
That's a brilliant insight.
Yeah.
And it highlights the fact that shadow work isn't just about personal growth. It's also about becoming more effective in the world.
Okay.
It's about developing the emotional intelligence and resilience
Right.
necessary to navigate the complexities of life and achieve your goals.
So it's not just about mitigating the negative effects of our shadow. It's
Yeah.
about actually using it to enhance our lives
Yes,
and achieve greater things.
precisely.
And I think that's a really important point to emphasize because
It is.
it seems kind of counterintuitive, right?
It does.
Like, why would acknowledging our so-called dark side lead to positive outcomes?
Right. You would think it would be the opposite.
Exactly, but both Green and Peterson seem to argue that this process of integration is actually essential for reaching our full potential.
I think so too.
Yeah, and we talked about how it can lead to increased creativity and productivity.
Right.
But I'm really curious to hear more about how integrating the shadow connects to personal power.
Okay. Yeah, that's a good one.
Yeah.
Well, I mean, think about it this way.
Okay.
When we deny those shadow aspects of ourselves,
Uh-huh.
we're essentially giving them power over us.
Okay.
They lurk in the shadows, influencing our thoughts and behaviors
Right.
in ways that we might not even be aware of.
It's like having a blind spot.
Yeah, exactly.
We're vulnerable to those impulses precisely because we're not fully conscious of them.
Right.
But when we bring those shadow impulses into the light of awareness,
Uh-huh.
we take away their power.
We do.
We can start to understand them, work with them, and even use them to our advantage.
It's like they lose their grip on us.
Exactly.
When we can see them clearly.
This reminds me of Green's emphasis on understanding human nature, both the good and the bad.
Oh, yeah.
He argues that this knowledge is essential for navigating the complexities of social dynamics
Right.
and achieving success in any field.
Absolutely.
So it's not just about personal growth then, it's
Right.
also about becoming more effective in the world.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's about developing the emotional intelligence and resilience
Right.
necessary to achieve your goals and make a meaningful impact.
I love how you're connecting all of these dots together.
Yeah, it's all starting to click for me.
That's great.
So we're not just mitigating the negative effects of our shadow.
Yeah.
We're actually using it to enhance our lives
Exactly.
and achieve greater things.
And to become more powerful in the process.
I like that.
Yeah.
And that's where the concept of channeling those shadow impulses into constructive outlets becomes so important.
Yeah, we've talked about that a little bit, but I'm happy to give you some more specific examples.
Yeah. Can you give us some examples of how this might look in different areas of life?
Sure. Let's take the business world, for example.
Okay.
Ambition, assertiveness, even a healthy dose of competitiveness
Yeah.
can be incredibly valuable traits in that arena.
But those are often the very traits that get demonized, right?
They are,
We're told to be collaborative, to prioritize teamwork above all else.
right? And those are valuable qualities too.
Okay.
But the key is to find a balance.
Right.
If we deny our ambition or suppress our competitive drive, we're essentially neutering ourselves.
Okay.
We're limiting our potential for success.
So it's about recognizing that those shadow traits, when channeled effectively, can actually be assets
They can.
in achieving our goals.
Yes, that same drive that might lead someone to ruthlessly climb the corporate ladder
Yeah.
can also be the fuel that propels them to launch a groundbreaking startup
Okay.
or create a product that changes the world. And then he kind of takes this even further with this idea of a hierarchy of meaning.
Yeah.
What's that all about?
Well, he argues that a single word only gains its full meaning within a larger context. So it's part of a phrase, a sentence, a paragraph, a whole book. And, ultimately the meaning extends to the entire body of human knowledge. And even as he puts it, to the cosmic order.
Okay, so every little action we take, even writing a single word, is somehow connected to this vast web of meaning.
Yeah.
But how does that connect to, like, our understanding of identity?
Well, it challenges the idea that identity is purely subjective. If our actions are reflections of this grand order, as Dr. Peterson suggests, where does individual choice fit in? It kind of raises some pretty big questions about free will and determinism.
Wow, that's a lot to ponder.
Hmm.
And it makes me think about, your interest in the political side of identity. If our actions are part of a larger cosmic order, how does that affect our understanding of, like, individual rights and responsibilities?
Yeah. And he actually tackles that head on when he cautions against the modern emphasis on purely subjective identity.
Right.
And he argues that this idea that we are nothing more than our desires is a recipe for immaturity and social chaos.
He uses that phrase warped two-year-old to kind of drive that home.
Yeah.
It's pretty provocative.
It is. It is. And he's basically suggesting that, if we only focus on fulfilling our desires without considering the needs of others or the long-term consequences, we end up behaving like spoiled children who just can't grasp the bigger picture.
So there needs to be a balance between self-expression and responsibility to something larger than ourselves.
Yeah. And he argues that a society that solely prioritizes individual desires over duty and responsibility is ultimately unsustainable. And he uses this really fascinating analogy to illustrate this point. the story of Peter Pan.
The boy who never grows up.
Right.
I can see where this is going.
Yeah, so Peter Pan represents this allure of avoiding adult responsibilities and clinging to fleeting pleasures. It's tempting, right? Who wouldn't want to stay young and carefree forever?
I think we all feel that pull to some extent, but what's the downside of choosing the Peter Pan path?
Well, he argues that it's a form of arrested development. By refusing to grow up and face the challenges of adulthood, Peter Pan remains stuck in a state of perpetual immaturity. And he links this back to the dangers of purely subjective identity.
So indulging in our every whim without considering the consequences
Yeah.
can actually prevent us from maturing and becoming like fully realized individuals.
That's exactly the point he's making. And this is where he introduces another key concept, the idea of duty. He argues that true maturity goes beyond simply fulfilling our obligations. It involves striving to become better people.
It's like there's this higher purpose we're striving for, something beyond just getting by and satisfying our immediate needs.
Yeah, absolutely, yeah. And he even uses the term magical agent to describe something that enters our lives and kind of pushes us to grow and change. It could be a mentor, a challenging experience, a sudden insight, even a moral calling.
I can relate to that. I mean, there have definitely been times in my life where I've been challenged to step outside of my comfort zone
Sure.
and kind of rethink my priorities.
And those are often the moments that lead to the most significant personal growth, wouldn't you say?
Absolutely. It can be uncomfortable, even painful at times, but it's ultimately what helps us evolve and discover who we truly are.
I think so too. And that brings us to another really powerful symbol that Dr. Peterson uses to illustrate this process of growth and transformation, the dragon.
Okay, now we're talking. Are we talking about like literal dragons here?
Not literally, of course, but the dragon is a metaphor for the challenges that we face in life, especially those that kind of force us to confront our deepest fears and limitations.
So the dragon represents those fears and obstacles that just seem insurmountable. Like we all have our own dragons to slay, metaphorically speaking.
Precisely. And facing those dragons, those inner and outer challenges, is often what pushes us to grow and evolve. And he uses another literary example here. He talks about Bilbo Baggins from The Hobbit.
Oh, yeah.
You know?
He has to leave his comfy hobbit hole and confront all sorts of danger.
Exactly. Not the life he signed up for.
Yeah.
But, it's through those challenges that he discovers his own hidden strengths and develops into a more courageous and capable hobbit.
Mm-hmm.
And Dr. Peterson suggests that, we all have that potential within us, that capacity to kind of rise to the occasion and become more than we thought possible.
So it's not about avoiding challenges. It's about embracing them as opportunities for growth. That's a pretty empowering message. But how does this connect back to the idea of identity?
Well, it reinforces this idea that identity is not fixed or static.
Right.
It's a process, a journey of becoming. And Dr. Peterson argues that we're constantly shaping and reshaping our identities through our choices, our actions, and the challenges we face.
So it's not just about who we are at this moment, but like who we are becoming.
Yeah.
It's about the potential that we have to evolve and grow over time.
Yeah. And sometimes that growth requires us to confront the darker sides of ourselves.
Ooh, okay.
Those aspects that we might prefer to ignore. He even points out that Bilbo has to become a thief in order to ultimately defeat the dragon.
That's an interesting point. It's like saying sometimes we need to tap into those, less desirable parts of ourselves to achieve a greater good.
Yeah, it's a complex idea for sure, but he's highlighting this fact that we are complex beings,
Right.
Capable of both good and bad. And true growth often involves acknowledging and integrating those darker aspects of ourselves rather than denying that they exist.
We have to face the shadow self, as some psychologists call it,
Right.
to become whole.
In essence, yeah.
Right.
And he takes this idea even further by arguing that we also need to confront the forces of darkness in the world around us.
Okay.
And this is where he brings back the dragon metaphor,
Uh-huh.
but on a grander scale.
So we're not just talking about personal challenges anymore.
Yeah.
We're talking about facing those larger forces that threaten our well-being, both individually and collectively. Like, what kind of dragons are we talking about here?
He's referring to the forces of chaos, destruction, evil. Think about the things that create suffering in the world. War, violence, injustice, disease, natural disasters. These are the dragons that, we as individuals and as a society are called upon to confront.
That's a pretty daunting task. It makes you feel a bit powerless, doesn't it?
Right.
How can we, as individuals, possibly hope to confront such overwhelming forces?
Well, he suggests that this confrontation is not just about fighting external battles. It's also about facing the dragon within. Our own capacity for, selfishness, greed, cruelty, and destruction.
So it's about recognizing and overcoming those negative impulses within ourselves
Yeah.
before we can effectively address those larger forces in the world.
Exactly. And this is where he brings in the Christian Passion story as the ultimate example of confronting evil.
Okay.
And he argues that Christ's willingness to face suffering and death, for the sake of humanity, represents the highest form of heroic identity.
That's a pretty powerful image.
Yeah.
But I can imagine some people might find that challenging, especially those who aren't religious.
Sure.
Is he saying that we all need to become martyrs to achieve true identity?
Not necessarily. It's more about embracing the principle of sacrifice, the willingness to stand up for what is right, even in the face of personal risk or loss. It's about recognizing that there are things worth fighting for, things that are larger than our individual desires and ambitions.
So it's about having the courage to face our own dragons,
Yeah.
both internal and external, and to act in accordance with our values, even when it's difficult.
Precisely. And he suggests that this is where true meaning and purpose in life are found. It's not about, seeking comfort and security. It's about embracing the challenges that life throws our way and using them as opportunities for growth and transformation.
That's a lot to unpack.
It is.
It sounds like he's calling us to step up and become heroes in our own lives.
He is, and he's reminding us that, true heroism is not about these grand gestures or superhuman feats. It's about making those daily choices to act with courage, integrity, and compassion.
It's about embracing our responsibility to make the world a better place, even in small ways.
Yes. And this is where the idea of duty comes back into play. He argues that we have a duty to ourselves, to others, and to the future to become the best versions of ourselves and to contribute to something larger than ourselves.
It's about recognizing that we're all interconnected.
Yeah.
And that our choices have an impact on the world around us.
Absolutely.
And that by striving to become better individuals, we can create a ripple effect that extends outwards, influencing our families, our communities, and ultimately the world as a whole.
That's the idea.
That's a pretty inspiring message. But is it realistic? Can we really hope to make a difference in a world that often feels so chaotic and overwhelming? That's the big question, right? Can we actually make a difference? I mean, Dr. Peterson seems to think so. He argues that striving for that higher purpose, confronting those dragons, might be the key to overcoming the very things that threaten us most: death, chaos, evil.
Right. And he's suggesting that by aligning ourselves with a sense of good, a sense of responsibility to something beyond our own immediate needs, we kind of tap into this wellspring of strength and resilience that helps us navigate even the most challenging situations.
It's not that we become immune to suffering or loss, but we find a way to move through those experiences with a sense of purpose.
Exactly, yeah. And remember that idea of the cosmic order that we talked about earlier? He seems to be suggesting that by embracing our responsibility to ourselves and others, by striving to become better versions of ourselves, we're aligning ourselves with that larger order.
It makes me think about those, ancient myths and religious traditions that emphasize finding harmony with the divine or aligning ourselves with a higher moral code. Is he kind of drawing on those ideas?
I think he is. He's pointing to a very human impulse, the desire to be part of something bigger than ourselves, to find meaning and purpose beyond our individual lives. And he's suggesting that this striving for a higher purpose might be the antidote to the chaos and despair that so often threaten to overwhelm us. He argued that even a simple act, like choosing a word, is connected to this vast network of meaning. Well, he seems to be suggesting that our actions, our choices, also have this ripple effect.
So each choice we make, each action we take, contributes to this larger tapestry of meaning, this cosmic order.
Yes, and by doing so, those choices also shape our identities. They reveal our values, our priorities, our commitment to something larger than ourselves.
He even suggests that the very act of writing can be a form of participation in this struggle between good and evil.
Right.
Each word we choose, each story we tell, has the potential to make a difference.
Absolutely, yeah. It reminds us of the power of language, the responsibility we have to use our words carefully and to create something positive in the world.
It's almost like each of us is a writer, crafting the story of our lives. And those stories, in turn, contribute to the larger narrative of humanity.
That's a beautiful way to put it, yeah. And it highlights this profound impact our choices have, not just on ourselves, but on the world around us.
So ultimately, it's not just about figuring out who we are. It's about choosing who we want to become.
Exactly. It's about recognizing our potential, embracing our responsibility to grow and evolve, and contributing to something larger than ourselves.
It's been such a fascinating conversation. We've covered so much ground, from the mechanics of writing to the cosmic battle between good and evil. It's really quite remarkable.
Yeah, and we've delved into the complexities of identity, the importance of duty and responsibility, and the challenge of confronting our dragons, both internal and external. It's been quite a journey.
Well, I hope this deep dive has given you, our listener, some food for thought.
So much to unpack, so much to ponder. And remember, the journey of identity is ongoing. It's a continual process of growth, transformation, and striving to become the best versions of ourselves.
Thanks for joining us on this deep dive. Until next time, keep exploring, keep questioning, and keep striving for that higher purpose.